Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first Atlantic Forum online in the summer semester 2021. My name is David Sirakov and I'm the director of the Atlantic Academy. I'm pleased that so many of you have tuned in. The Atlantic Forum is one of our formats in which we discuss central topics on US domestic and foreign policy and thus transatlantic relations. And together with our cooperation partner, the Political Science Department at the Technical University in Kaiserslautern, we've been doing this for over 20 years. In this context, I would like to warmly welcome Florian Böller from the Technical University, and as a representative of the department, I want to thank him for the cooperation in the last couple of years. I would also like to thank the German Foreign Ministry for sponsoring this and other events in the Atlantic Academy program. When we talk about transatlantic relations, its past, present, and future, security issues quickly come to the fore. And that is not only the case with regard to the past 4 years. However, the Trump administration, at least from my perspective, the president's open aversion to the alliance, the constant criticism of partners, and the consequences of, at least in rhetorical terms, increasingly isolationist policies have left deep marks in the transatlantic relations. But, and this will certainly be one subject tonight, the responsibility for disruptions within NATO is not to be found solely in Washington. The European partners also contributed and continue to contribute to the flaws of the alliance. For instance, the discussion about the 2% goal clearly shows this and also makes clear that Trump must certainly be viewed as an amplifier, but not as the cause of this particular conflict. Tonight, we will focus on these and other topics, and I'm very pleased that we were able to put together a really great panel. And before I hand over to Florian, who will introduce you the panelists, I would like to invite you to take part in this discussion with your questions and comments and remarks. Please use the chat function at the bottom right. This is a moderated chat, which means that you will not see your question in the chat history, but Florian will pass them on to the panelists. So without further ado, Florian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Atlantic Forum. Thank you, David, also for mentioning this cooperation between the Atlantic Academy and the University of Kaiserslautern. I'm very pleased that we can continue this Atlantic Forum in this semester and also do the summer school together. Tonight, as you mentioned, David, our topic will be transatlantic relations, transatlantic security, and the relationship between the United States and Europe. And I'm quite excited that we have assembled such a great panel for tonight's discussion with 3 experts from Europe, the US, and Germany to discuss those issues. And as David mentioned, later on we will have a question and answers session, meaning you can pose your questions, comment on all the stuff that we discuss. Of course, our panelists are very happy to give their best to answer your questions. We will certainly touch a range of issues, but your questions will be important to not to forget some of the issues that you have in mind. So I'm sure all of you will agree with me that this topic of transatlantic security is quite timely, given that we have now 100 days since Joe Biden took over the White House and certainly changed US foreign policy already within those 100 days. We will discuss to what extent and with what effect in terms of transatlantic relations. But I'm equally sure that you also agree that there will be still challenges ahead in this relationship. For example, today, there were news of attacks and violent outbreaks of the conflict in Afghanistan, while NATO continues to withdraw from Afghanistan. So this will certainly be one aspect that we will talk about today. So I'm quite honored to introduce to you now our panel. For that, let me, do I have, David, do I need to activate the feed of our...
No, the mics and the cameras are activated. So Falk, Nele, Michele, you're invited to start your mics and cameras.
Okay, great. Yeah, good to see you. Hi. I will begin the introduction with Nele. Nele, you are farthest away, at least virtually, in Washington, D.C. right now. So let me introduce Nele Ewers-Peters, who is currently a DAD postdoctoral fellow at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. at the School of Advanced International Studies, where she does research on issues such as European security, security cooperation, but also German foreign and security policy. Dr. Ewers-Peters studied European studies, social sciences, and international relations, not only in Germany, but also in Finland and the UK. She finished her PhD at the University of Kent in the UK in 2019. And I might add that beyond academia, she also worked in the European Parliament. Let me just briefly mention two of her recent publications, which might be of interest to all of our attendees tonight. Brexit implication for EU-NATO cooperation, Transatlantic Bridge No More, in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. And in German politics, last year, 2020, Germany going midstream, balancing versus leadership in EU-NATO cooperation. So you see, she's an expert on the topics that we discussed tonight. Nele, many thanks for joining us tonight, and we will look forward to your comments and contributions. Next, I will introduce Michele Testoni to you in geographical order, if you will. Michele, welcome to this panel. Professor Testoni teaches international politics at the IE University in Madrid, Spain. Previously, he also taught at the University of Bologna, Dickinson College, and John Cabot University in Rome. He is an Italian national, I might add. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Florence, and also a master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University, where Nele is currently researching. So there is a connection. In his research, Michele focuses also on international security issues with a special interest in US foreign policy and NATO. And in that context, let me recommend his recent book, an edited volume on NATO and Transatlantic relations in the 21st century, which just came out with Routledge. So have a look. There are quite many interesting takes on the current situation within NATO. So welcome, Michele. Very glad you could make it. And last but not least, Dr. Falk Ostermann, who joins us from the University of Giessen, the Justus Liebig University, where he is a postdoctoral researcher and an assistant professor. He is a specialist on parliaments and foreign policy, French foreign and security policy, and NATO. He also, let me add that because many of my students are with us tonight, he also focuses on constructivism, critical security studies, and discourse theory, so recommended to all who are also interested in those issues from a methodological perspective. He was previously an assistant professor at the Free University of Amsterdam. He received his PhD in 2015 with a thesis on France's security identity, and this was then published as a book by Routledge recently, so take a look at this. And of course, let me promote his most recent book, Die NATO, Institution, Politiken und Probleme kollektiver Verteidigung und Sicherheit von 1949 bis heute. It's a textbook in German, which I recommend always to my student. Welcome, Falk, to this Atlantic Forum. Glad you could join us. Okay, so before we start, let me just mention that we have agreed to discuss three major topics. We will start with the United States, given the 100th day of the Biden administration, and then move on to European strategic issues, and finally touch upon some of those specific topics such as collective defense, Afghanistan, or arms control. And then we will open up for questions from the audience. So let's start with the United States and NATO after Trump. Maybe a question for Nele, because you are closest to the Washington Beltway and the White House. I'm sure everyone agrees that the Biden administration has a different approach to foreign policy in general. But how would you describe and evaluate what the Biden administration has been doing in the last 100 days, and how is that affecting Europe and NATO?
Hi, everyone, first of all, and thank you again for the invitation, Florian. When it comes to Biden, well, first of all, he has lots of cleaning up after Trump, to be honest. So as we've all heard probably in the news, but also his speech at the Munich Security Conference event, he said, okay, I'm committing, or the US is committed to NATO, and kind of America is back. And the question obviously is now, is America really back, and where's Europe? As you mentioned that, for the last 100 years, it's basically just, okay, getting those relations back on track. So actually saying to its NATO allies, saying, we are back, we are here, committed, what's our plan for the future? On the other hand, though, the US is really preoccupied with many other problems internally, but also external. So we of course have the China question looming around, but also internally, there's so many domestic issues that he's been working on, getting the economy back on track, the whole healthcare system, the whole COVID-19 vaccination process. So he's really preoccupied with many other things. And I guess NATO is not number one on his agenda, but it certainly is an important issue, especially for the longer term perspective. And so the administration is basically just working on getting relationships with Germany and France going on track, but also many other countries within Europe. So that's the big question, is rather what's going to happen in the future, not what happened the last 100 years, which is not very representative, I would say.
Yeah. Since you mentioned the cleaning up part of the Biden administration, Falk, I was wondering, if we look back to the last 4 years of the Trump administration, how much damage was really done to NATO as an institution? I mean, we all heard what Trump tweeted, what he said in the news, how he shifted his policy positions also in regards to NATO. So how would you see how much of damage was done to NATO as an institution?
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for that question, for that excellent question. So lucky that we only had 4 years of Trump, right? So this is how I would possibly start. My bottom line would be that with these 4 years in mind, I'd say that we've had open heart surgery with an unqualified surgeon, but the surgeon has been replaced right in time and the patient survived. This being said, whenever you use an analogy, you're getting nailed on it, so let me work through that one by one. So I think that, the damage Trump and NATO as an institution was a severe open heart surgery with a risk of failure. actually, and this partially answers your question on the damage. So he didn't understand its purpose and history. He did not understand NATO's difficult balancing act between US lead and its consensus culture. He put his finger into some right wounds of places, such as financial burden sharing, but he also kicked NATO's liberalism down the street without understanding that it's the glue that holds it together, and that he was for some reason excluding a favorable outcome because of the way he acted and how this put also domestic pressure on colleagues. So ultimately, he did not care, and what might have saved us, actually. What else saved us? Maybe a guardian angel Biden, but well, if you want to get a little more scientific about it, it's of course the institutionalist perspective, which you've been addressing, Florian. And so let me make an institutional plus constructivist point here, if you wish, and as you introduced me as a constructivist. So when you write a textbook on the oldest multilateral alliance of the world, as I did, you cannot help but come to be amazed and impressed by the way NATO allies wanted to or have accepted the institutionalization of security and defense policies in NATO since 1949, right? So I'm talking about institutional pressures for cooperation, bureaucracies enforcing it, actually, cooperative practices that are enacted on a daily basis, right, by 12,000 and more agents, right? And hundreds of thousands of people in the armed forces and the diplomatic and political class that have been socialized into it. So yeah, NATO survived because it kept calm and carried on, if you want. What it does on a daily basis, it coordinates defense and armament policies, it strategizes, it talks to each other, it accommodates everyone and de-escalates conflict by moving it to other or lower channels or trying to ignore it, actually, at times. Sometimes this was more successful, sometimes less, but in the end, fate decided in its favor, if you want. So what's precisely the damage done? Three things, I'd say. First, during the Trump years, the damage to trust, in my opinion, has been huge. And I'm citing no less person, but our colleague Tobias Bunde from the Munich Security Conference and Hertie School, who has said that you do not have to leave NATO to destroy it. So that would be my first point, which seems to be temporarily fixed with the arrival of the new US administration, but it has certainly left traces in the strategic thinking of European decision makers all along. Second, the Trump years have shown us that all of the glue, call it liberal, call it social or interest-based, it helped, but it also came close to the breaking point because of leaders' insufficiencies and different agendas. So again, Biden and Harris saved us from this problem, but it might just have been be a temporary relief, as the damage that is hidden behind Trump is divergent strategic interests that span nothing less but the whole globe, and no common strategy how to deal with them. So let's make no mistake, Biden and Harris and Blinken and Austin will be nice, but no less demanding toward allies. And if I may add a third and final point, let's also not forget about the external dimension to the turbulent time NATO left behind it. The Putins and Xis of this world have taken note of what happened. They will brutally exploit allied dissonance or try to seed it themselves. So when core national security interests might be at stake, this is going to become very uncomfortable, as we remember from INF or Open Skies. So, and how we tackle this and survive this in the current state of contestation of foreign policy, of liberalism, of democracy, I don't know yet, but I'm happy for your ideas. So to conclude, again, the surgery succeeded, but the convalescence period is far from over and insecure.
Thank you, Falk. Excellent metaphor you're using, especially in those pandemic times when we have all graduated, it seems, to become virologists rather than political scientists, at least in a hobby way. Michele, Falk touched upon the remaining challenges that sort of have not been solved just by a new incoming administration. From your perspective, what would be the most pressing issues currently between Europe and the United States?
First of all, I need to catch up to follow up what my colleague said. And so thanks for the very kind invitation, for the presentation. In the volume here, there's also a splendid book chapter on Germany made by Dr. Böller. So it's very good for the whole of you to spread knowledge. So as far your question is concerned, I think that there are, besides what has been said, there are a few points that need to taken into account when we talk about the foreseeable future of transatlantic relation. The first is the domestic tendencies inside the United States. Certainly, it was a very bad daughter, so to follow Falk's beautiful analogy, but it doesn't mean that that line of alternative medicine, if I can speak this way, has gone with wind. It was a very tight election. Trump has been the best loser ever in the US elections, and the future of the Republican Party, so to speak, doesn't look particularly good. So whether Trump will run for president in 2014 or not, it will be likely a Trumpist candidate for the Republican Party. And we tend to know that, you know, those who comes next tend to be even more radical, not that the one that set the stage. You know, this is something that is very natural, that is visible in history and sociology. So you set the stage, and the followers, your believers, tend to be even more radical. So we need first to take, in the medium long run, to take into consideration this alternation, this very psychological alternation in the American domestic public. Almost nobody seems to talk about what used to be, I mean, since at least January the 7th, in US polarization, but it remains deep down into the American social fabric. Second, we need to take in, I think, the Biden presidency needs to provide a framework for how to maintain together the three flanks of NATO. Now, of course, there's a revival of great power politics. We saw Russians exercise, or the muscle show off in eastern Ukraine. There's the Arctic region. I think that NATO should indeed talk much more about environmental policy and how the environment will affect security. I mean, we will likely see an increased operation in the Arctic region due to the freezing of the pack of the ice. Which affects first of all European countries, at least the high North bloc. So Norway, Denmark, the UK in this case would be very interesting to discuss what could be the future role of Britain. I mean, post-Brexit, Britain, not only the whole of the world, but in the British nearby, so which is the Northern Sea. And second, it's correlated to this. I mean, between the the northern flank and the southern flank, where I'm talking to you from, we used to be the primary importance for NATO, at least the 1990s with the Balkans, arms control in the Iraq, in failed states. Then came terrorism, but I think there's a contradiction in the way in which we, as scholars of international relations, try to describe and explain reality, and on the other way around, in which reality actually goes, which is this increasing mismatch, according to me, which relates to the importance of the Mediterranean basin. Because if we say, and I think we are correct, in saying that the future of security is going to be a combination of traditional and non-traditional threats to security. Now the Arctic, with climate change, is somehow is trying to climb the ladder. But the Mediterranean is, I think, it's if you take migration flow, desertification, the rise of the seas, the arrival of China, because the naval route of the Belt and Road Initiative exactly inside the Mediterranean, so in the core of Southern Europe. And this is a framework of analysis that I think is missing, that we need to, the whole of us, as scholars as well as policymakers, try to look at. So to how to U.S. domestic public opinion, the fluctuations between the two poles in U.S. society, and simultaneously to how to provide a coherent framework, not just ask Europeans to do more, because Europeans do. Maybe some country like Spain who should do more, that's fair to say. But what kind of glue, what kind of framework, what kind of storytelling is the Biden administration going to provide the rest of the world? So I'm very much in agreement with what Falk just said at the end of his conclusion. So the other word, the rest of the world was the cinema eating popcorn. And they laughed. It seems they laughed so much.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting points. Also, thank you that you mentioned the Arctic dimension, which is in Germany at least not as prominent maybe as some of the other issues, but it's highly relevant, in particular in view of climate change. Let me maybe go back to the point you made in the beginning, and also Falk alluded to, and Nele, how the domestic side of the United States is connected to this alliance politics side, to NATO. I mean, Falk mentioned that the lack of trust was one of those major issues as a result from the Trump administration. And Nele mentioned that the Biden administration is now primarily focused on domestic issues. So my question would be to all of you, or whoever wants to go first, how can the Biden administration rebuild trust when at the same time it has to focus on combating COVID, rebuilding the economy, and there is, as Michele mentioned, a Republican Party, which is at least some part of it still in the Trump wing of foreign policy. So how is that dilemma between domestic and international politics to be solved for the transatlantic alliance? Do you have sort of an idea how the Biden administration could solve that, or what should the Biden administration do, or what could European partners do to manage those relations in a trustful way, in contrast to this lack of trust during the Trump administration?
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So when you ask a question about trust, right? I mean, it's always very complicated to build up trust when it's broken down, and we all had that experience past as well, probably somewhere. But I think when it comes to the international level and within NATO, I think Biden is on the optimistic side because he already had the good relationships himself to many European leaders. So he's actually always been welcomed in Europe amongst other NATO leaders. So that I think is a good sign that he actually has the potential to build up trust. So it won't be as difficult than for maybe other potential leaders. However, we all know there is still this kind of trade issue between Europe and the US. And I think this is where it will stand and fall. So I would say that the US will have to support Europe in its own economic endeavors and lift tariffs. And I think this is one way of building up trust also for the security and defense dimension. Another thing I guess it is that the US administration under Biden will have to listen to European concerns more closely. That while the US is also looking at obviously Asia and focusing on China, it will also actually say, okay, we need to have a deal within NATO. The deal could be either this a clear-cut division of labor that Europeans do their own thing for Europe while the US engages outside of Europe, or they have to come up with a strategy where they actually agree on security concerns that are most pressing. And I guess the upcoming summit in June will show whether Biden is able to build up trust by then, which is very important because at the moment they're also drafting a new strategic concept. So this is, I think, it's going to be a signaling point where NATO will be able to express whether it has actually this coherence still within the alliance, or whether it's going to fall apart further and become more fragmented. So I think Biden will definitely have to do it via trade and economic issues to build up trust first.
Okay, thank you. Anyone care to comment, Michele or Falk?
Okay, thank you. I think everything what Nele said is incredibly important. I would be, however, quite optimistic on the trust dimension, actually, because, I mean, so we all know there are underlying factors, but Trump was the really one factor which drove relations nuts over the last 4 years, right? So Trump is gone, and we didn't just get any president, but we got one of the possibly most transatlanticist presidents in US history, with a huge personal network as well. So everything what Trump destroyed because of his personality, Biden actually doesn't even have to rebuild it because he owns it already, right? So I'd be rather positive from that perspective. And the interesting thing, I mean, two more issues, wasn't it that second or first call to a foreign leader was to Stoltenberg from NATO, right? And the other aspect is that he brings Harris into the whole NATO and secure and defense policy thing, as if they were just going in tandem. I think these are two very important issues, which also, of course, try to instill trust with its allies that this is not just me, but this is also my vice president. This being said, I think to 3 points, and all of which relate to what Nele just said, in order to make NATO work also for the American domestic audience, be it the Republican Party, the Democrats, or the public, we need to talk strategy. So that's been hidden behind Trump, right? And now we need to talk about it in a much more serious way. And it's not just Asia. Asia is a huge part of it, but I don't think that actually repairing transatlantic relations, or for repairing it, it would be enough to just devise, Nele, some sort of division of labor, as we were talking about it, like over the last decade, that the Europeans do Europe and the US manages Asia. I think that won't be enough anymore in order to address the strategic challenges that the alliance is confronted with. So this might have been a possible solution for, let's say, the early Obama years, maybe until 2014, but with the challenges we face in Eastern Europe, and with the tremendous importance of global power politics and great power confrontation, doing the old burden sharing sort of between Europe and Asia won't be enough anymore. The second point is, very quickly, it will be talking money, so that point won't go away. And the third is very important, what you said, Nele, clarify underlying issues, which is trade, which is Nord Stream 2, where a very important and very interesting suggestion from Wolfgang Ischinger lies on the table, and I don't really see anyone seriously taking that up. I don't, or tell me about it if I missed something. Another underlying issue might be the e-commerce taxation. So really, these underlying issues are tremendously important as well, because they stabilize via the overarching framework of the transatlantic community, right? But complete agreement with what Nele said, except for the point that the transatlantic division of labor won't work as we figured it out in the 2010 years.
Michele?
Well, I need to say that, which is true. I do agree with what Nele and Falk mentioned. It couldn't be otherwise. Let me try to add something on this, which is, let's try to speculate with a new debate that the press has started to launch in the last few weeks, because as you, Florian, mentioned at the beginning of our chat, these are the 100 years of the Biden administration. And when we say 100 years, our historical analogy and memory goes back to FDR. And so the debate that in the US press has started to pop up is, to what previous president does Biden resemble the most? And the debate is Biden the new FDR or is a new LBJ? And basically a vast percent of the commentators, ourselves, I guess, included, say, well, let's hope it looks like more FDR than LBJ, because LBJ, at least in his foreign policy, is associated to the drama of Vietnam War, whereas Roosevelt has a much more positive legacy. But I think that this analogy is not just something that needs to remain on the press, but it should accompany our discussion, because LBJ and Roosevelt actually lived the both of them, in very difficult historical periods, because FDR was the product, of a changing, decaying, but still multipolar world. The FDR proposal of the 4 policemen was a pre-Cold War proposal, while Lyndon Johnson was, 100% a Cold War warrior. So what kind of, back to the future psychological game we have today in the United States administration? Will the Biden, Harris, Blinken team look at the world? What do they think? What is their perception? What does their worldview? Because this is fundamental, I think. This, we need to put the framework behind the scene, because if trust, totally agree with, need to be reconstructed, and I guess that issue by issue, we need multilateralism and effective working, sincere multilateralism, which means proposing, listening, proposing. It's this dynamic game. This needs to come to terms with what kind of system we are living in. Are we moving toward a strange bipolarity with the United States-China dualism? Because if you look at military spending, for instance, or technological relations, it seems that, it's of course not a new Cold War, but there are some tendency towards a multilateral, a bipolar world. Or will the world lean toward an asymmetric multipolarism? We have the European Union, so the Franco-German axis. We need to take into consideration, the 3 big forgotten, 4: Japan, India, Russia, of course. This Turkey being the maverick of the Middle East. So what kind of world is both the US administration, but also we as Europeans have in mind? Because if we are able to project, to imagine the future in the next 5 or maximum 7 years, this will tell us what kind of multilateralism and in what ways will trust be, they will try to rebuild trust. Because it makes a difference if you say, no, the world is leaning toward bipolarity, so the Europeans have a role. No, the world will likely, although asymmetrically, but turn toward multipolarity. So Europe will have a different role, and therefore the transatlantic bargain need to be understood and played differently. So I think that we are walking through a sort of fog of ignorance, so to speak, which is also the attractive part of our discipline.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I guess that already brings us to the second major topic of our discussion tonight, that is the role of Europe and how Europe positions itself. Falk mentioned strategy. There was already a discussion about European strategic autonomy before the Biden administration took over. Nele, how realistic is that goal of a autonomy of Europe in terms of its security policy?
So even though I'm a full-blown Europeanist, I would say, in a way, I think it's still not really realistic. Let's be very honest about this. What is European strategic autonomy? 27 member states in the EU, they still have no clue what it is. There's so many different ideas of European strategic autonomy. Is it autonomy from an actor, right? Is it autonomy from the US? Autonomy from any other external factor? What kind of autonomy is it? Does it mean, we are able to project our interest externally, internationally? What does it mean for NATO? Because that's obviously part of Europe, right? So I think what Europe has to do, first of all, is to agree at least the baseline of what European strategic autonomy means. And I think that because France is such a driver behind this, it shouldn't push it too far, because I guess on that way you will lose many other countries, and I think they will just result in more disagreement than actually agreement. So, and when we talk about many smaller member states in the EU or in the Euro-Atlantic space, they still see NATO as a cornerstone of their security defense and not the EU. So when it comes to any kind of hard warfare where we need the US capabilities, the EU is going to be out. So I think as much as I like the idea of European strategic autonomy, I don't really want to call it autonomy, there's this new word of capability to act or sovereignty. As much as I like the idea, because it ultimately means that Europe actually does more, that Europe finally gets its grips on we're doing, investing more, we're actually more responsible in the world. I think it's not as realistic in a way that especially France wants to see it. So that's my take on it.
Falk, what would you say regarding France? I mean, you're the French foreign policy expert. Macron certainly has some idea, or must have some idea, what European strategic autonomy is.
Well, Macron has certainly ideas about how European strategic autonomy shall look like. It won't be autonomy against the US. I mean, we're far beyond those debates, actually, since at least the 2000s or so. So those are no longer the debates, I'd say, which the French are having. It will be autonomy for Europe in the positive sense of the word, of being able to do something. But at the same time, although Macron really, I mean, he has tried to put a new emphasis or a new impetus for European defense, he didn't get, well, he got somewhere. He didn't get where he wanted to, but that was also not very likely. But that's also somehow not that much of a problem, because what France learned through Libya under Sarkozy was that you never count on the European Union if you wanted to deliver strategic autonomy, basically. So that was the tipping point. That's the argument I make at length in my book, actually, so that this was a tipping point where the French no longer equated European autonomy with EU security and defense policies, actually. So the French, to some extent then, if you ask the question about France, what Macron did was, on the one hand, really his own convictions, because he is a convinced European. I mean, that's also how he won the election, right? But at the same time, he also builds on this different legacy which France has developed since at least 2009, which is that no longer put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to European security and defense policies. That being said, I think I don't see much of a change there in France with Macron due to the circumstances. I mean, apparently it was other European leaders blocking it, and Germany is a huge roadblock here. So I don't deem it very likely to see any sort of European, least EU autonomy anytime soon, for all the reasons which Nele just lined out. So let me just add one more dimension to it, which is that when we look at what we have accomplished in European security and defense cooperation over the last years, or what we have even only aimed for, it's no longer about policies. It's about the defense industry. It's about mutualization of capability procurement programs. It's about some groups of states in PESCO trying to build up or to have some capable niche capabilities, which are important in itself, but it's no grand strategic design whatsoever. Forget about the ESS, forget about the EU global strategy. When it comes, they don't merit the word, so speaking, because they don't say what means they might put to ends, and that's the big problem, in my opinion. So how will Germany react to that? Frankly speaking, I mean, we've had that debate all over the last couple of years, but concluding on a more positive note, things are sort of opening up a little over the last month or so, right? So we've seen very interesting, clear, open, outspoken commitments, for instance, of the Greens now to NATO. No experience, I think those were the words of Chairman Stimmir. Yeah, we've had a couple of very prominent positions, outspoken positions from Annalena Baerbock. So let's see, there might be some new dynamics from the winter onwards, but those dynamics will be in the sense of making Europe able to work more effectively. It won't be a European strategy, one that would in any way be able to be an autonomous, to make Europe, whatever it is, the EU or others, an autonomous foreign policy actor independent from the United States. I don't see that coming in the same way as I'm a pro-European as Nele is. Florian, your mic is still off.
Yeah, sorry, beginner's mistake here after a year in pandemic. Michele, are you as pessimistic as Falk and Nele? Because you mentioned all these global multilateralism, multipolar world order issues. I mean, Europe must have a position regarding where it stands. Is that clear, or would you agree that there is no real strategy behind what the EU is doing?
I'm afraid I need to give a pessimistic answer. So as Nele said, I mean, I think this is too much ado for nothing. Today I taught my freshman international politics the ABC of European integration, and my mind was with you this morning, and said that actually the European integration process started from defense, and it has always failed. So, and I think it's not by chance. But also I do agree with Falk in the sense that if it's true that, at least in my opinion, the main problem of the failure of this European, the attempt to create a European pole of power is largely because we start building the house from the roof and not from the basement. I'm sorry, this is maybe not be politically correct with, with a constructivist mentality, but I think that in Europe we tend to always start, from the framework and not from the objectives. The Anglo-Saxon pragmatism is we start from the objective and then we find framework. And I think it's a much more effective way of acting. However, as Falk mentioned, European strategic autonomy is a splendid opportunity to become, for Europe, to become autonomous, independent, take the future with our own hands as far as industry, procurement, the digital technology is concerned. This is a splendid opportunity, and I think that the European policymakers have to run this avenue, because this is part of the future. And the 21st century will be largely ruled by those who will know the know-how. Those who develop the proper technologies will run the 21st century. And in this case, competition is competition. And I think that this liberal attitude is a factor for good. Last, I don't know if it's last, so I don't think, Florian, to respond to your answer, it's very difficult to find the common position. I mean, look, even from the EU's board nearby, think about Russia. So it's I know that from the United States sounds a little bit strange, that a country like Germany, but also Italy, defend us from Russia, but then we deal with Russia. Well, geography has a place. The Nord Stream is already in place since quite a few years, so we are not discovering anything new. So, I mean, this Nord Stream 2, it's bigger, it's larger, but it follows a pre-existing path. So I think that it's difficult. Here in Spain, where I'm talking to you, Russia is a very, very far away country, and Spain participates in the EFP, but Russia's there. We have here in Spain other concerns. It's Morocco, it's Northern Africa, it's Latin America, it's the way in which Venezuela develops, is what kind of the naval strategy NATO could set up for the arrival of the Chinese. These are other questions. Last but not least, you mentioned the Green Party. I think that we are all very eager to see what is going to happen in German elections in next September. Well, the Joschka, I have a good memory of Joschka Fischer. Joschka Fischer was, in my own opinion, a nuce, no? a person that embodied what could be in the late 1990s a good initial step for the European strategic autonomy. So the way in which Germany started, to play its own role, but in a good, consistent way. I'm very pleased and very happy to see that the Greens are coming back. They could provide a novelty to this, maybe to launch, a new deal where I don't know whether green or what kind of colors for not just for Germany but the whole of Europe. I think that the whole of us need fresh air, and the whether or not time will tell what the Merkel era will going to be assessed, but we need fresh air, and I'm positive in this case. So my initial answer to the question is I'm pessimistic, but I'm I'm positive for the future, and I hope not to be wrong this time too.
Yeah, thank you for inserting this positive notion at the end. But let me double down on this European strategic autonomy issue. Would it be fair to say that after 4 years of Trump, where everybody in Europe recognized the need to do something, to stand on its own feet, as people like Merkel, Macron repeatedly mentioned, that this idea is now gone with the wind because we have a different administration with Biden in the US. So it's not necessary anymore to stand on its own feet, to develop its own strategy, strategic outlook, whatever you would like to term it. So I'm wondering whether that may be a fairly dangerous proposition, because who knows, in 4 years, as Michele mentioned, it could be another Trump, maybe an even more competent leader with the same ideological trait as Trump, which would be more dangerous to NATO and transatlantic relations. So I guess that wasn't really a question, but if you would like to comment.
Let me, maybe in an effort to break the row so that we get into different speaking order, just very quickly continue what Michele said by answering your question anyway, Florian. So I agree that we won't stop trying to seek for some sort of European autonomy. So Europeans, since the Trump years at the latest, are lucid about what happens when there is a hostile hegemon in the White House. However, that it reminds me, with the situation we are in, reminds me of what Michele was just saying about the framework and the objectives. And here I would continue, Michele, what you said. I'm not sure whether Europeans agree on what standing on your own feet really means. They certainly agree that they need more capabilities. But this doesn't necessarily translate to a joint strategy, what to use them for, right? Let us just remember the battle group, which has been inaugurated, I think, in 2006, right? And has never, ever been used since. There were 2 or 3 attempts, right? And all of them failed because of national vetoes. And frankly speaking, I don't see that we've gotten beyond that point yet on the EU level. So we will most likely see, like, of course, the French and the British will have a closer idea of what standing on your own feet actually means, also in terms of strategy and being willing and able to engage in a theater together. The Danes will most likely, or the Norwegians will contribute to that or so. But I don't see the EU in having any considerable role here. And this is, I think, where there's on the one hand, there's expectation management, which we should adopt here. But on the other hand, it's also an opportunity. So we will see most likely minilateral coalitions of European states, which might be supported by an even larger amount of European states. And I'd say this will be the maximum of as close as standing on your, as close as it gets to standing on your own feet. But there won't be the one big European agreement on that. Although, as I agree with Michele, there are openings which we didn't have a couple of months ago, which we certainly didn't have before Trump, but it's not all working in one direction.
Okay.
Can I add something to Falk's comment just now? I want to say, while we see more minilateral frameworks, I totally agree with that, but I see also more maxilateral, so more within EU and NATO. So it's not only just we do something through the EU or NATO. I think it's this either or question is something from the past. I think it's more like, how do we do these things together within both frameworks, and maybe even as a minilateral framework, but covering the membership of both organizations. So I think what we see is not necessarily always what we see like standing on your own feet. I mean, I can't even tell what that means, to be honest. But what I would want to see is just groups of interest that they agree on something, that actually want to provide the necessary capabilities, and then they just benefit both EU and NATO frameworks. Just try that.
If I can add, I think that we were caught in this initial moment by what you said, Florian, that a competent Trump was both a nightmare and something unlikely. You know, we remained a little bit, you know, difficult to position ourselves. In this mini macro lateral, you know, ping pong tennis table play, we have, and I think in this case could be a first moment, you know, in which, you know, the poker players will start to reveal their cards, will be this apparent, you know, the Summit for Democracy that the Biden administration seems to be organizing either December this year or January next year. So in this case, we ordered in this, you know, the roadmap toward that summit. Let's see what the future holds in store for this year. Really interesting to see what whether we will have, you know, the same old, you know, this, you know, Wilsonian scores, you know, the United States lead and everybody behind, or we try to see, you know, and I mean, as we said at the very beginning, you know, still a masculine, the testosteronic, so to speak, you know, the tough resistance against China and Russia and the challenges ahead, but, you know, a more nice and, you know, a more equal footing between the United States and the different European sensibilities. You know, the CDF, it's the Uncle Sam will be, you know, use some more nuances. Also the appointment of Ambassador Nuland can raise some elbow. I know this is a good nomination. We know why. Let's see what the future holds in store. We see that there's still some honeymoon wandering around. I doubt whether we will see soon a new rapprochement between the West and Iran, for instance, you know, to put other flesh over the fire, because this supposedly won't pay off. At least it's going to be very, very soon and not close to the midterm elections. This is a very tricky topic that doesn't have domestic rewards, unfortunately. So in this case, maybe, you know, the Europeans, you know, this could be another topic for autonomy. So we should lead now the wagon and not always wait for Washington to lead. But let's see it. The autumn looks interesting.
Okay, thank you. I promised our audience that we will take questions, and I would like to do that and use those questions to dive into specific topics that are of interest to our participants. Let me quickly read through a couple of questions which have already been asked. There is one which maybe we can take on first regarding the issue of Ukraine. That is a question from Thomas Schneider. And he asks, which position do you expect the Biden administration to develop in order to ease the Russian-Ukraine tensions and eventually regarding Crimea and the annexation occupation issue? I mean, that's certainly a question for Europeans as well. It's on the European continent. So let's take this question first. Who wants to go first? Michele, do you want to go first?
Okay, let me. I can be an icebreaker. I would like to see some kind of defreezing on the situation. It seems that United States and Russia are largely for domestic reasons to create wars, but there must be some space for maneuver. Maybe it's too early to say. The problem is, what can we as NATO give Russia that China doesn't give them already? Which might be legitimization. The Chinese maybe already given them. There was in these days the idea of a new great power concept starts to pop up again. Let's do it, but are we ready to sacrifice Ukraine for what? So it seems for me that if you're familiar with game theory, we are still in a situation of a chicken game, and the equilibrium will hardly be changed anytime soon, unless something moves in Russian civil society. But again, I might be wrong. I'm aware of the fact that Russia is what it is, but we should never lose the attempt to engage Russia. So maybe this this new act of strength toward Russia while maintaining a new dual track policy maybe could be effective. I'm skeptical, but we need to try.
You may see in the chat that I have added another question in that context from Michael Salaya. He asks, for how long is Europe going to continue to show signs of weakness towards Russia? I guess this is connected to Ukraine, but also to other issues. Nele or Falk, do you want to comment on the Ukraine-Russia transatlantic context?
I can. I would say that Europe is that weak when it comes to Russia. It's just a chosen path of diplomacy. I think Europe will not show this kind of, will not show its teeth by showing, okay, we have these capabilities and we could harm Russia, because that's not the case. But I think what Europe as a whole will always do when it comes to Russia is, because they need each other. So that you always try to have this diplomatic talk and dialogue with Russia, and I guess sanction is probably the hardest that the EU at least will do. So I would say what I would suggest is also what to agree with Michele is that there should be a concerted effort of Europeans but also Americans when it comes to Russia, and that we need both kind of a NATO response, or a NATO kind of showing the teeth, and the Europeans kind of talking to Russia. So at the same time, I think we need both this kind of dual track of we have the hard capabilities, but we prefer the soft approach.
Is for example, regarding Ukraine, is membership action plan on even NATO membership, is that something that is realistic for the next 10 years, let's say, Falk? Because that is sometimes mentioned in the German media, and I just wanted to know what you think about it.
Well, fresh up my memory if I'm wrong, but it was Sarkozy and Merkel shutting down Ukrainian membership action plan or any preliminary stage to that back after 2008, right? And Georgia. So I wouldn't expect anything to come in that on that front for the next years to come. It might get a little more, yeah, not just, I mean, Nele, you were talking about capabilities versus or and diplomacy. And so, Michele, you were talking about the double track procedure. So I might say we might even see some more aggressive support for Ukraine, right? I mean, we've been talking and we've been delivering defensive military capabilities for a while now. I'm not sure which allies exactly, but some of them at least are doing that. I could imagine that we're going to continue to see such a policy. It's going to be sanctions for sure. In my opinion, I completely share the opinion of Michele, who said it's going to be a frozen conflict for quite a while. If the Russians decide to escalate beyond the current state of affairs, this is where it's going to get interesting. So be it either in eastern Ukraine to go more aggressive there, as they sort of did a couple of weeks ago, right? Or 1 week ago, with the large amount of troops which they amassed there. Mediterranean is going to be, Michele, getting back to what you said in the first round, Mediterranean is going to be really interesting, and that might be a point of friction. But otherwise, I really think we should talk Nord Stream 2, yeah, because Nord Stream 2 has the potential to be this game changer. And the proposal from Ischinger, I think it was originally, which I alluded to already, it's so interesting that this could really be the game changer. I mean, build that thing up to the German shore, connect it, but simply let it be empty to the point where the Russians finally decide that the mutual energy and economic relationship is more important than permanently instilling damage to basically every other aspect of mutual relations, be they diplomatic, be they involvement and into domestic affairs, be them poisoning and murdering of oppositional agents on foreign soil, right? I mean, I really think Nord Stream 2 would have the potential to be a game changer. And again, the new government will be incredibly interesting to watch what it does on that. I think this is all I have to say there.
Yeah, in particular, if it includes the Green Party, which is fairly critical of the Nord Stream 2. So you mean if Germany would have the leverage to use it to say, Russia, please change your behavior. So using Nord Stream 2 actually, instead of just canceling it, that would be, yeah. Okay, we have another question from a student actually of mine, and he is interested in US-China relationship and how it affects NATO allies. So you should see his question in the chat. He asked, how likely do you find it that not just the US, but also NATO as a whole gets more involved in that region? And could the increasing conflict between China and America be a significant hindrance in rebuilding transatlantic relationship? I think an excellent question. Nele, do you want to go first, or Falk or Michele?
I'm not an expert on China at all, even though a good colleague of mine does work on China and the relationship between China, Europe, and North America. First of all, I would say that if NATO gets involved more with China, I think it should get it right. Not like what it does with Russia, kind of freezing dialogue or freezing relations. But I think what NATO should do, if it were to get more involved in Southeast Asia, is it should keep up the dialogue from the very beginning. I know that there's been this talk of like a NATO-China Council whatsoever. That would be a good idea if the Chinese side obviously is open to those initiatives. As said, I'm not a China expert, so I can't tell of what the Chinese view on this is. However, what I would say is that from the very beginning, so actually from yesterday or last year on, NATO allies need to agree on how to approach China and what the actual interest is. And I think we see that with Russia. We see these divergences within NATO, that member states don't agree on how to approach Russia and how to actually talk to Russia. And I think this should have been done yesterday with China, that NATO should have actually find an agreement on what do they actually want the relationship with China to look like. So I think in German it's 8:05 or whatever I think the saying goes. So yeah, it's about overdue to actually find a common interest when it comes to China.
Michele or Falk, do you like to comment? You don't need to. We have a couple of other questions.
Yeah, very briefly, I know that there was a debate, especially in France, if I'm not mistaken, given this Atlanticist turn of Sarkozy, to use NATO as a potential example of linchpin to create a new Chinese the containment. In this case, I think the Biden administration is very proactive with the meeting of the Quad. I don't think that NATO could play a preeminent role, because it would mean to overstretch the alliance, to allow countries that don't have interests there, to have a say. I think in this case we will see a repetition of these unilateral engagement. For instance, we saw a couple of days ago, the British air carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, left the port of Portsmouth, basically to go exactly there. And so maybe there will be, multilateral fora are always useful, but I doubt NATO itself will have a primary role in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Falk, actually, I have another question for you in particular, since it's regarding NATO as an institution. You may see it in the chat now. I have opened it from Lea Conrad. She asks about your opinion on task overload in NATO, I guess alluding to the danger that NATO might take on too many tasks. I mean, Michele talked about the Arctic region. We have the eastern flank, the southern flank, climate change as an issue, maybe China. So how should NATO deal with that? I guess that's the gist of the question. Falk, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Leah, and for putting it in front of us, Florian. Let me just very quickly follow up on what the Nele and Michele just said on Asia. So there's certainly, and this connects to Leah's question, there's certainly the danger to task overload, and we're rather going to see individual allies, or many allies individually develop strategic approaches towards Asia-Pacific great power confrontation. But I'm also absolutely convinced, as I said earlier, to paraphrase Richard Lugar here again, so NATO is either going out of area or out of business, right? That was what he was saying back in the 1990s, that if NATO allies don't manage to find some sort of common ground, how to approach Asia-Pacific great power confrontation, then NATO going out of business might actually be a serious danger again, for all the reasons which we, by the way, discussed already, because there would also not be any credible European alternative. So Leah's question, so it already touches on that, right? But so task overload. I mean, there is of course a danger that this is something that might happen. But well, 2 points. Maybe Cold War wasn't easy either, right? So it was an incredibly large-scale effort of coordinating national armaments industries, defense plans, and lastly, force plans in order to withstand Russian aggression. We all know that the nuclear component was incredibly important to NATO strategy because otherwise they would have been overwhelmed conventionally. But so I think we shouldn't forget here from an institutional perspective that Florian is charging me with, that NATO has done similarly complex stuff in the past, and on the contrary to any other organization on the world in the military realm, it actually has means. It has, again, 12,000 people. I think 12,500 or so is the goal for this or next year or so. 12,000 people to deal with all these issues, be it Asia Pacific, be it Ukraine and European deterrence, be it Africa, Mediterranean terrorism. So what other organization, if not NATO? Yeah. So, and I don't mean to be completely uncritical here of what NATO did or did not do well in the past. This is not what I mean, but I want to say NATO is a tried and tested vehicle for this sort of endeavors. So where else should you try to coordinate? Because, well, that's one of the basic institutionalist arguments, right? So the table to sit at in order to discuss these issues is already there. The house is there, the framework is there, the habits are there, the practices are there. Yeah, so it's all there in NATO. So I think, yeah, task overload is a danger, but at the same time, NATO has dealt with many different tasks beforehand. We all know that NATO never was exclusively a collective defense organization, but it has managed collective defense anyway quite successfully during the Cold War. If you ask me about prioritization, so European deterrence capabilities will remain crucial, so will nuclear disarmament or arms control issues. And the third, again, I think, is how to deal with Asia-Pacific great power confrontation. And the fourth, maybe something which Michele referred to very explicitly, will be Europe's southern neighborhood. So these are the four issues which I think I'd say would be NATO's priorities, without being able to say this is going to be priority number one and this is going to be priority number four, because this is not how NATO works, right? NATO must accommodate the Spanish, Michele, as you said. NATO will have to do something with regard to the south. It will have to do something with regard to the east, and it will have to do something with regard to the far east or far west, depending on which direction you're looking at. And this is how NATO works. So it will try to give something to Spain, to Italy, to France, but it will also try to give something to the Baltic countries, because otherwise, I mean, it won't work anymore, but NATO made it work over the last 70 years.
Thank you, Falk. A really good answer to a complex question, actually. Maybe let's take this question from JFK Institute in Berlin, Susanne Linehan-Winter, and she asks regarding the Republican Party, and that the Republican Party is still convinced, at least a significant part of the party, that Trump, that the election was stolen and that Trump should be the president. So her question is NATO prepared for another isolationist US president with a populist agenda? Somehow touched upon this question, but what would be your answer? Michele, do you like to comment?
Well, it would be tough. I mean, I think we already prepared. Trump was the novelty. As Falk mentioned, it was the patient was saved at the very last minute. But we don't know what another blow, another disease, or another virus, I know if we want to remain on a virologic analogy, would provoke. I think we need to take this into consideration. So it's, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room or a lingering question, but it's a chance that is very likely. So sooner or later, the Republican Party will elect. Granted, it's U.S. politics, so we will soon have a Republican president, and given the social demographic cleavages in the United States, The Republican Party seems to be, unfortunately, destined to remain on this kind of the political spectrum. The United States will unlikely, withdraw from NATO, but try to hinder the institution by delegitimization, which is worse, if getting out or delegitimizing from within. In this case, of course, we open up Pandora's box, which is again the European strategic autonomy. What could be mean? I mean, also in this case, populism doesn't last forever. We saw that already. If we think about these conservative isolationists of the 1930s, Senator Nye, La Follette, how they were campaigning about the United States engagement in Europe, 90 years ago, they were doing quite a harm to the United States position itself. So I do hope that if the Republican Party would remain a hardcore, right-wing party, this, sense of, unilateral, transactional, I wouldn't say isolationist, but this hard-nosed, can I say stupid, or no, is this politically correct? Agenda will remain, but not as strong as. But the NATO has to be ready for that.
Can I chip into that just very briefly? Because I feel like I think something is missing also in this question is that, okay, I think we've now ticked the box with the US, it's back on track, right? But what about the other countries? We've seen lots of democratic backsliding within the EU and NATO. So I guess what we're seeing with Poland, Hungary, and I think when it comes to NATO, especially Turkey, is another troublemaker. So I think we should not forget about there is still this possibility of this fragmentation because other states are, have become a bit on the illiberal side as well. So it's not only the US, but also other member states. And the second point I want to raise is actually there is this working group has established within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to build a NATO Center of Democratic Resilience. So resilience is a big topic in international relations at the moment in generally, but also in the NATO. And I think that if NATO is able to build up more resilient, but also democratic resilience, I think it will be prepared enough to deal with another more isolationist and nationalist US president, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Falk.
Great point, Nele. So let me add to that and actually take up the cudgels on behalf of US Congress, which Florian, you are usually doing with your scholarship. And let me just remind, so I'm also a scholar of executive legislative relations, and so we shouldn't forget about US Congress here. And let me even take up the cudgels on behalf of the GOP. So the populist moment, which it might end earlier, it will end at some point, we don't know when. And even if we have another populist president in the way we had, even a more capable and competent one than the last one was, this doesn't mean that things must play out the same way. And I think what is very important here is everything we've talked about. If NATO gets its stuff together, to put it very bluntly, over the next couple of years, and there's a chance for that because of Biden, because of Harris, because of all the things which we've been talking about, then actually the debate and the discourse will be a completely different one when a next Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz might be US president, because then they will also be able to address their public opinion, their own public and their own voters by saying, you see, things have moved in a better direction. So this is no longer this big an issue as it was under Donald Trump. So I think we should be careful not to compare or to assume a complete 100% same policies between Trump and a possible next, but beware radical right populist US president.
Okay, thank you. Michele, do you want to have a final comment? Because I have to say, time is already up for our panel. We have it's 7:30. I'm afraid we have to cut it short at this point. There remain a couple of questions. I'm very sorry that we don't have the time to take up all your questions. There was just this moment a question about Turkey, which we haven't touched, and also arms control, Afghanistan. So I'm afraid 90 minutes discussion about NATO is still not enough to cover all the issues for sure. But let me, on behalf of the audience, thank you three, Falk, Michele, and Nele, for participating in our discussion. I think although we did not cover all the topics, it was a lively debate, and we did cover some ground at least. And this is to be continued in the series of the Atlantic Forum with other guests this semester. And I hope I see you three also in the Atlantic Forum sometime soon. So thank you very much. Thanks to our audience for all the interesting questions. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you and goodbye. David, do you want to close our session? Then I probably have to switch out.
Yeah, I just want to say some final remarks. And first of all, let me thank you all, Nele, Falk, Michele, Florian. It was a really great, very exciting discussion, and I could have listened to you even more. Of course, I would also like to thank you, dear participants, for tuning in, and I hope that you were able to take away a lot of interesting food for thoughts. So I think it was really great, and I also hope that we can welcome you back at one or the other event of the Atlantic Academy. And if you want to, you can find more information about our program on our website. And if you have not yet subscribed to our newsletter, I cordially invite you to do so. So finally, it remains for me to wish you all the best. Again, thank you to the panelists, and above all, good health to you all.
Thank you. Goodbye. Stay safe.